Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder, violence, and addiction.
Like most of you, we're obsessed with true crime. Even in our spare time, we'll tune into news coverage of high-profile cases. One such case that's currently ongoing is the trial of Richard Alexander Murdaugh, or Alec Murdaugh.
On June 7th, 2021, Murdaugh's 52-year-old wife Maggie and 22-year-old son Paul were murdered at the family's hunting lodge. As background, Alec Murdaugh was a prominent local attorney. He was also the one who discovered the bodies and made the initial 911 call. But suspicion soon fell on him, and he was arrested in July 2022.
Part of the reason this case has attracted so much attention is that it concerns a veritable legal dynasty. The Murdaugh family has long held sway in the low country of South Carolina. 3 generations of Murdaughs served as solicitor, or district attorney, of the Palmetto State's 14th Circuit District. But more recently, the family attracted controversy. In 2019, Paul was hit with 3 felony charges after his friend Mallory Beach died in a horrific boating accident, which occurred while the intoxicated young man was piloting the vehicle. Alec Murdaugh was also admittedly dealing with a severe drug addiction, which he says prompted him to begin stealing from his own law clients. Prosecutors allege that these issues boiled under the surface, eventually culminating when Alec Murdaugh ultimately murdered his own family members.
The trial is currently underway in the 14th Circuit of the South Carolina Circuit Court, having started back on January 25, 2023. Creighton Waters is the chief prosecutor for the state. Attorneys Jim Griffin and Dick Harpootlian are defending Murdaugh. Judge Clifton Newman is presiding over the trial. The media has followed this case closely, including national outlets, documentaries, podcasts, local press, and more. And we've been following it too. We imagine plenty of you are also keeping an eye on it.
We've been talking about this case behind the scenes. Recently, we also chatted with a source who is available to talk through aspects of the trial so far. We figured we'd share our conversation with him.
This is a criminal defense attorney from the western part of the United States. We've talked to him about a number of cases on the show before. We know his identity and his credentials, but we're keeping him anonymous because he still practices law.
The attorney is going to share his thoughts on the cross-examination of Alec Murdaugh, the evidence against the once powerful attorney, and other observations that could indicate where this trial is going. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, the Murdersheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murdersheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murdersheet.
And this is the Murdaugh Murders, a defense perspective on the trial.
Yeah, this is a very in-depth and complicated case. So it would be hard to cover the case from start to finish in one episode, certainly. But what this case involves is a prominent attorney named Alec Murdaugh, That's his nickname. I believe his first name is Richard Alexander Murdaugh, but he goes by Alec Murdaugh, from South Carolina, a place called Hampton County, which I understand is about an hour and a half from Charleston, in a place called the Low Country. And Alec Murdaugh has been a prominent attorney, carrying on the family tradition of prominent attorneys in this area for about 100 years, with Alec being an attorney for about the last 25 years. I think he's 54 years old right now. And his family has had a stranglehold, I guess, for lack of better terminology, on both the prosecutor's office up until recently and the plaintiff's personal injury market in South Carolina, in Hampton County, South Carolina. One thing that I think is important for people to understand about that is that, so basically for the last 100 years, with maybe the last 10 years being an exception, one family has controlled the prosecutor's office for 5 counties, a 5-county region. They call it solicitor down there, but it's the same thing as district attorney. And that same family has also been the preeminent plaintiff's law firm, has controlled the preeminent plaintiff's law firm.
Well, neither of us is from South Carolina, but that seems very odd from my perspective. Do you share that perspective?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's, an inherent conflict of interest. I mean, we get, as defense attorneys, we get upset when the prosecutors spoon feed these really good personal injury cases that arise out of their criminal cases, whether they be auto accidents or, sex abuse cases or what have you. But what I see in my jurisdiction is prosecutors spoon feeding these, multi-million-dollar plaintiffs cases to their buddies who they used to work with in the DA's office, who are now plaintiffs' lawyers. And that bothers us as defense lawyers, but there's nothing we can really do about it. I don't think that's unethical, as long as there's no type of hidden kickback back to the prosecutor. I don't think there's anything unethical about that. The difference with that situation and what we have in the Murdaugh family is, you have one family who's doing both functions, essentially prosecuting people, deciding who does and doesn't have to go to jail within this 5-county region, and also being the primary person to collect money on behalf of injured persons for this region. And so you have to think that they were prosecuting and then taking the plaintiff's side of the same cases, which I believe is potentially a conflict of interest. And you also have to think that people were afraid to go against them on their plaintiff's cases for fear of being prosecuted. So that gives them a tremendous amount of leverage and power in this rural region of South Carolina. So that's a long answer to your question, Anya, that it's very unusual and I think problematic.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why this case has really gone national is the fact that you have this legal background and the idea of a dynasty operating sort of with a lot of power and maybe a hint of, certainly corruption in this part of the country. And maybe now we could jump to the murders themselves, where this starts crashing down. And, I'll also note there's also been a lot of coverage around other deaths linked to this family, but what is currently being tried is the murder of Alec Murdaugh's wife and son, youngest son.
Right. And so what we would call that is familicide, killing your own family. Very rare, which is, I think, one of the things that makes this case so unusual, rare to sort of annihilate your own family. The profile would be called family annihilator. And if you watch the cross-examination of Alec Murdaugh by Creighton Waters, one of the last questions Mr. Waters asked him is whether or not he was a family annihilator. Yeah, it's a rare profile. It's a rare type of case. The two that come to mind prior to this would be the Christopher Watts case and then Christian Longo out of Oregon. If you believe the prosecutor's case, what happened here was that the Murdaugh dynasty started to unravel vis-a-vis Alec Murdaugh's drug use. He, by anyone's account, he was heavily addicted to opioid analgesics, and that's been a big part of this case. And that apparently, according to Alec Murdaugh, led him to start stealing multi-million dollars of client funds, diverting funds from his clients that should have gone to his clients, and taking them for his own personal uses, whether it be drugs or what have you. And then in 2019, there was a very high-profile boat accident involving Alec Murdaugh's son, Paul Murdaugh, in which one of Paul Murdaugh's best friends, by the name of Anthony Cook, his girlfriend named Mallory Beach, was killed in this boat accident. Appears to have been killed by blunt force trauma to the head and then drowning. But she disappeared sort of immediately from this boat accident. And this boat accident actually played a huge part in the current trial for reasons we can talk about in a minute. But as a result of this case, Paul Murdaugh, who by many people's accounts was sort of this holy terror of a rich kid who sort of thought he could get away with anything he wanted and had a whale of an alcohol and potentially a drug problem. So Paul Murdaugh is then criminally charged in the boat wreck case with the equivalent of DUI manslaughter in a car, but in a boat. If we call that a buoy, boating under the influence, and then the homicide that went along with it. Very serious charges for Paul Murdaugh. This was, I believe, the accident was February of 2019. And there was a lot of maneuvering by Alec Murdaugh and his father, Randolph Murdaugh III, who is affectionately referred to in the family as Handsome. There was a lot of maneuvering by these guys on the night of the accident to try to protect their son and grandson, Paul. And what they did was they showed up at the hospital and tried to make it look like someone other than Paul Murdaugh was driving the boat at the time of the accident, when it was clear by everyone's account that it was in fact Paul. So following that accident and the criminal charges in 2019, apparently Alec Murdaugh felt a need to really ramp up the embezzlement from his clients of attorney fees. That behavior really escalated. Then on the June 7th of 2021, what we know is that for the first time, Alec Murdaugh was confronted by a member of his law firm about the diversion of client funds in sort of Fargo-esque fashion, the movie Fargo. I understand he sort of, minimized and diverted his conduct away from the questions and acted like this was all a big misunderstanding and a big mistake, and the money was somewhere, but it was a misunderstanding. And so that was June 7th, 2021. Later that same day, that evening, he calls 911 and reports that he finds his son and wife murdered at the family estate, which is referred to as Moselle. At this point in time, most of the family, they have multiple houses, but most of the family was living at a private hunting lodge called Moselle, which is maybe 15 or 20 minutes from the county seat of Hampton, in sort of a rural part of a rural area to begin with. The police arrive shortly, and Alec Murdaugh then makes a statement to the police saying that he had been gone, came back and found this tragedy. And what had happened was his son had been killed with a shotgun in a part of the property known as the dog kennels. And then his wife, Maggie, had been shot with a AR rifle, which they refer to in this case as the 300 Blackout model, which was the model of the AR rifle that was being used, an unusual assault rifle that they had, sort of a high-end weapon. They can't tell exactly what shotgun was used, but with respect to the 300 Blackout, this was a gun that the Murdaughs had used frequently. This was a family that, again, lived on a hunting lodge, had all kinds of weapons, to include the types of weapons that were used in these homicides.
I think when this first happened, there was a lot of conjecture, possibly spread by Murdaugh's side of the story, basically, where, they're like, oh, could this be connected to the boat crash, essentially? Someone out for revenge. But, of course, now we know that investigators really started looking at Alec himself at this.
Yeah, and so one of the most interesting things about this case to me is Alec Murdaugh kept talking to the police. He talked to them 3 times, once on the 7th of June, once on the 10th of June, and then once, I believe, about 3 or 4 weeks later. These are all recorded. Everything's recorded these days. Any interview that's done by law enforcement is going to be recorded. These were all being recorded, and Dave Owens was the law enforcement officer who was doing the interviews, and he works for an agency called SLED, which stands for South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. And you have to remember that Alec Murdaugh is a very highly skilled attorney. Alec Murdaugh himself has a background as a prosecutor. Alec Murdaugh has worked hundreds, if not thousands, of cases and understands these types of dynamics. Shortly after he calls 911, he calls a member of his law firm who comes down and assists him with the interview. The attorney allows Alec to give a full statement to Dave Owens on that night. And then 3 days later, Dave Owens comes back and wants to talk to Alec Murdaugh again. This time, Alec Murdaugh has some much more qualified criminal defense attorneys at his side, the ones who are currently representing him in the trial, who are Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. And these are real kind of heavy hitters out of South Carolina. Dick Harpootlian is also a state senator. His wife is U.S. ambassador to Slovenia. And Jim Griffin is, although he's not necessarily known as being a criminal defense attorney, a very highly qualified trial attorney. And these two also coincidentally were Paul Murdaugh's criminal defense attorneys for the boat wreck case. So on the second interview, they have Dick and Jim sitting in the back of the patrol vehicle. This interview is all being recorded by the in-dash camera. And then in the front, you have Alec Murdaugh talking to David Owens. He gives another very detailed statement, and then he gives a third statement a couple of weeks later, again with his 2 attorneys. Now, the decision by his attorneys to let him talk became, I believe, the most critical component in this case and really affected everything that happened afterwards, including probably even that Alec Murdaugh was even charged. You have to remember in a case like this that there were 3 factors that were always going to make Alec Murdaugh the chief suspect for these homicides. Number 1, he found the bodies. The person who finds the bodies is almost always the suspect. Number 2, he called 911, and that is highly related to, but also involved with number 1. The person who calls 911 is almost always the suspect. And number 3, the husband is always the primary suspect. And of course, he was the husband of the deceased and the father of the son in this case. And so right there, that should have been a lot of red flags to these attorneys that this is not going to be an information gathering mission by these police officers, by these detectives. This is going to be an interrogation. This is going to be a hunt for whether or not they can prosecute Alec Murdaugh. This kind of reminds me of something Alan Dershowitz said in one of his talks. You always have to assume that your client is guilty in these cases. You don't want to act like they're guilty in your interactions with them. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt. But you have to assume that they're guilty. And the reason that you have to assume that they're guilty is that if you don't, you potentially could make some mistakes. And the mistake that was made here was that they allowed Alec Murdaugh to talk to law enforcement multiple times. And what that did was lock Alec Murdaugh into a false alibi. In a case like this, in a murder case, the timeline is always critical. And the prosecution, the police are always going to try to establish a timeline of who was when, where, at what time, to sort of try to eliminate and, exclude and include people who could have possibly committed this crime by, establishing who was where and when. And the timeline in this case is absolutely critical because what Alec Murdaugh had told the police was he had been home that day, pretty much, most of that evening, but for the 1 hour time period, the 1 hour window in which his wife and his son were murdered. And what Alex said was he was over at a property in a town called Alameda visiting his mother. I believe that was about a 15 or 20-minute drive each way. He originally told the police that he was there for an hour and a half. That was a lie because they were able to get the OnStar data and his cell phone data, which showed that wasn't true. By early July, late July of 2021, Alec Murdaugh was locked into this false alibi. And the most important part of that alibi was that he had not gone down to the dog kennels the day of the homicides. He was adamant about that. And he was asked about that in every interview, whether or not he had gone down to the kennels, which was the scene of the homicide, again, on the day of the homicides. And he was adamant that he had not until, this 10:20 time when he had discovered the bodies. Well, I believe it was about 7 months later, law enforcement was able to unlock Paul Murdaugh's phone and get some of his digital data from Snapchat. And it turns out that Paul Murdaugh had made a video that he posted to Snapchat, of him down at the dog kennels at, I believe, about 8:45 that evening. And the coroner has the time of death between 9 and 9:30. In this video, you can see Paul Murdaugh messing with one of their hunting dogs, and you can hear Maggie Murdaugh in the background talking about another one of their hunting dogs, and she's talking to someone, and you can clearly hear, if you had been watching the trial and listened to Mr. Murdaugh's testimony, you could clearly hear that was Alec Murdaugh also talking to Paul and Maggie Murdaugh down at the scene of the homicide right before the murders occurred. And again, this was something that Alec Murdaugh had denied doing. He had denied being down at the kennels anytime in immediate proximity prior to the homicides occurring. He said he hadn't been down there that day.
I was just going to ask you, we're just talking, and I'd love to get your opinion. And maybe you can kind of keep going over some of the facts of the case, but I'd love to. Do you think this is a strong case against this man? It seems like there's a lot of smoke. Doesn't sound like it's very much a physical case, more of a circumstantial case. But a lot of this stuff looks pretty bad for Alec Murdaugh, in my opinion. I'd love to know what your assessment of it is.
It's absolutely a circumstantial case. But most homicides are circumstantial cases. Most homicides don't have witnesses. Most homicides don't have a lot of direct evidence because the primary witness is deceased at the conclusion of the perpetrator's conduct. And by nature, those types of crimes are normally done in secret. And by their nature, those types of crimes are normally done committed in a fashion where the perpetrator hopes to not be apprehended. So I don't think it's a huge problem for the state in this case that it's a circumstantial case. I think this is a very strong circumstantial case for the state. My own personal opinion is that he probably did it. I think there's very strong evidence of it. I think the strongest evidence in the case is him lying about being down at the kennels on the night of the homicides and the Snapchat video that Paul had taken with his voice on there. So that puts him at the scene of the crime, and it puts him there with no one else other than the two decedents right before the homicide happens. I also think it's a strong case, and one thing that I think the listeners should know is that if you didn't watch the cross-examination of Alec Murdaugh, it was fascinating. And no matter what happens in this case, Alec Murdaugh is going to prison for a long time. And what happened in the cross-examination was Creighton Waters kind of went to the bullet points first. He said, the reason you're testifying is that you have to explain why you lied about the most important fact of the case. And they kind of had some back and forth about that. And then that kind of flowed into Creighton Waters asking Alec Murdaugh about all the times that he stole from his clients. And so that becomes a very important aspect of this case for two reasons. One, One thing Creighton Waters was trying to do is to show the jury that this is a man who will lie and steal and cheat anytime it's to his benefit, that he's good at lying, that he can look at someone with a straight face, look at him right in the eye as he's telling them that the money that they're supposed to get is no longer going to go to them, and then give them some false reason why that's not going to happen. And so he's establishing that he's a good liar and that he's sort of, a scumbag, someone who thinks low enough of the legal system that he would act in such a reprehensible way. Another thing Creighton Waters was doing there was he was going ahead and getting confessions from Alec Murdaugh from all these other cases that are pending. So Alec Murdaugh also has 99 charges pending pertaining to financial crimes, all of which he has now confessed to under oath. And so that's not going to bode well for Alec Murdaugh. So he has that going for him. And then again, I think the strongest piece of evidence for the state here is that Alec was down at the scene of the homicide right before it occurred and that he lied about it. And to me, why would he possibly do that unless he had committed the crimes? There's also some very bad facts for the state here. I think probably the worst fact for the state is the two guns. The defense has made a huge deal over the fact that there had to have been two shooters because there were two guns used. The people were killed in close proximity to each other and both in temporal proximity to each other, right after each other. And the reason they hypothesize about that is, had one been killed, the other would have taken off right away had they had the opportunity to. Therefore, they know they were killed right next in time to each other by two different weapons. So the two guns is probably the best fact for the defense. The prosecution is also has a lot of other good facts, I believe. The circumstances of Alec's life leading up to the homicide. And what the prosecution is really trying to do is to convince the jury of a motive. When we talk about motives in homicide cases, you don't have to prove motive if you're a prosecutor. You don't have to be a mind reader. You don't have to prove why someone did what they did. I think potentially a mistake the prosecution is making in this case is spending so much time trying to convince the jury that the motive the prosecution believes was the motive is the correct motive. And I think that one of the things that has the effect of doing is sort of making motive an element of the case, not overtly, but sort of subtly, sort of something that the jury is going to want to agree upon, even though they don't have to agree upon. And I think that's dangerous for the prosecution to add elements to the case that they don't have to prove. That kind of reminds me of the Casey Anthony case and the prosecution. He spent a lot of time in that case trying to prove what the cause of death of Caylee Anthony was. And he didn't have to prove cause of death. All he had to prove was that Casey caused the death, not how she caused it. And so I think the jury in that case, and the defense lawyer in that case really spent a lot of time talking about cause of death in the closing and that the prosecutor didn't prove it. So I think in this case, in the closing, we're going to have the defense talking a lot about how the prosecution failed to prove motive, which again, the prosecution doesn't have to prove motive in a case like this. I think the prosecution, where they did well on cross-examination was two places. I really think they got Alec Murdaugh sort of dead to rights on these financial crimes and making him look like someone who is a very low moral character. And I really think that the highlight for Creighton Waters was really hammering Alec Murdaugh on the timeline. The timeline in this case, once Alec Murdaugh's new story came out, the timeline on this case became even more unforgiving than it had been previously. The timeline is really so tight in this case that it's going to be tough for the jury to believe that someone could have come onto the property undetected, committed these homicides, left the property all in the short period of time that Alec was gone. I don't know what's going to happen. If I had to guess what the outcome would be, I would guess hung jury. I think Alec Murdaugh did very well on the stand in a lot of respects. The strategy was sort of to go all in and to own everything except for the murders, which again, has its pitfalls. If that worked, to sort of humanize him and make him understandable to the jury, then I think the prosecutor is in trouble. And again, it's a murder case. All they need to do is get one person for a hung jury. And I think the likelihood that all 12 of these people are going to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Alec Murdaugh committed these crimes is low for a lot of reasons, including, the power and control this family has over the region.
I was going to ask about that because it's like a two-sided thing, I think, where you have this family that was incredibly powerful for years, like really, truly a dynasty in the legal system in this part of South Carolina. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that this story went national, well before Murdaugh was even publicly being named as a suspect or arrested or anything, with a lot of really negative facts about that family and the goings on there and Paul's boat crash. And then also later on, Alec Murdaugh's bizarre suicide, fake murder attempt situation that kind of came on the radar. And I guess as a defense attorney, when there's so much negative information getting out there about your client on a national basis and the national media is really running with this, and then you have, how does that balance out in your opinion? Because it just seemed like this was all over the media well in advance. And would that have really hurt the defense? Or, is that balanced out by the fact that they were very powerful locally? So perhaps that's also going to influence the jury.
Well, that's a tough question to answer because I don't know these people personally, and I'm not from the region. But in general, you don't want a lot of negative publicity in a case like this. There were all kinds of things going on in the Murdaugh family, none of them good in the years preceding this trial. I believe that the way that they combated that in this case was by putting Alec Murdaugh on the stand. And I think they kind of had to put him on the stand on this case, primarily because he had to get up there and he had to explain why he was in that video right before the homicides occurred and why he had lied about it, basically. Those were the two strongest pieces of evidence for the prosecution by the time it became time to put Alec Murdaugh on the stand. And there had been a lot of publicity about that he was this liar. And he, I'm sure you guys, like I had seen those interviews over and over on either Dateline or on HBO or Netflix of him telling the police that he wasn't not down at the kennels unequivocally. And then going forward and showing the video that Paul had taken with what was clearly Alec Murdaugh down at the kennels. And so he was caught in this lie. And so I think the primary problem of the negative publicity was that everyone had known that he had lied about his alibi. And again, this goes back to the issue of the attorneys, believing in their client too much and allowing him to talk to the police over and over again, close in time to the homicides before they had any information about, whether or not Alec was telling the truth. They were faced with a situation where they had to put Alec Murdaugh on the stand because of his lies, because they had been so publicized by the media. I think everyone was still surprised that he took the stand.
I know from following true crime, it's often stated that if you don't have to have your client take the stand, maybe you don't want to take that risk. But could you speak to that as far as strategic, why that is so risky? But I mean, at the same time, Alec Murdaugh was a former prosecutor. He is he is an attorney. So maybe he's kind of uniquely going to be a case where that is a good idea.
Yeah, I would say very risky proposition in any case. What I tell my clients is look, if you take the stand, the case is all going to be about how you did on the stand and whether or not the jury believes you. And I think that's totally true. And I think that is what this case is now going to boil down to. I think it is a rare situation to put a client on a stand on a case this serious, particularly then when you're going to open them up to horrendous cross-examination, which is going to certainly caused Alec Murdaugh to serve many years in prison for embezzling from his clients. I mean, those cases are locked in. But I think, in this case, they felt that they had no other alternative, given that they felt that they had a credible explanation why Alec Murdaugh was down at the kennels and why he had repeatedly lied to the police about being down at the kennels right before the homicides had occurred. And so I'm sure they struggled with this. I am sure Alec Murdaugh had a lot of control and a lot to say over whether or not he was going to take the stand. I'm sure there was a lot of back and forth and lost sleep over whether or not he was going to take the stand. But ultimately, they made the decision to put him on the stand. And I think the case now comes down to how he did and whether or not the jury believed him. It was probably the toughest cross-examination Creighton Waters has ever had. It lasted a day and a half. I know it was, because I've been involved in cases like this with, where witnesses are on the stand forever. I know it was exhausting for Creighton Waters. I know it was exhausting for Alec Murdaugh. And it became this battle of the wits. As you mentioned, Alec is a highly seasoned, highly skilled attorney, former prosecutor, probably knew where Creighton Waters was going with every line of questioning. All in all, I think Alec Murdaugh did very well. And most of this was on direct, sort of the emotional reaction that was consistent with the emotional reaction throughout the case. So I think his behavior in court when he described what had happened to his family was consistent with his historical behavior, which I think was very helpful to the defense. How he described what he saw, how he was crying during his presentation. I think he did very well there. I think he did very, very well when, and I don't think Creighton Waters ever should have gone here, but I think Alec Murdaugh did extremely well. And this was probably the highlight for him when he was talking about the alternative theories of the case. I have no idea why Creighton Waters started asking Alec what he thought had happened to his wife and kids. That's not relevant. What Alex thinks happened. It's speculation. Unless Alex knows what happened, it's not relevant testimony. And Alex, I think, in a very articulate fashion, was able to tell the jury the problems associated with the boat wreck, the threats, and sort of the singling out for this bullying type of behavior that Paul had received as a result of his perceived involvement in driving the boat that killed Mallory Beach. I think that was probably the highlight. And then I also think he really, really got Creighton Waters when Creighton was saying over and over again, isn't it convenient that we're hearing this story about how you lied about your alibi for the first time after you've heard all this testimony? And then I really think Alec got him when he said, well, we reached out to you and wanted to talk to you some more, but you wouldn't talk to us. If that's true, I think that's a real, and I'm sure it is, and I'm guessing they're going to call an investigator or something to corroborate that. But I think that's a real problem for the state, and it kind of throws some cold water on the strongest point of the state's case, which is Alec Murdaugh lying about his alibi and then changing his testimony. I think the reason that Alec Murdaugh gave to why he changed his testimony, I didn't believe that. I don't think that was very effective. So what he gave a million reasons, and I think Creighton Waters did a fairly good job of beating up Alec Murdaugh about all the different reasons and how convenient it is about how now he has all this ever expanding list of reasons of why he lied to the police. But the reasons that he gave, I don't think were didn't make a lot of sense. Right? He said that he was a drug addict, that he was paranoid. He said that he didn't trust SLED, which doesn't make any sense because he's been a law enforcement officer and an officer of the court, and his family's been synonymous with law enforcement for the last 100 years. He said he thought this officer was involved in a case where the defendant was set up 10 years ago, and he had all of these convenient reasons for why he lied to the police about where he had been. I think one place that Creighton Waters really could have got him is he should have asked him, well, how did you know this was so important? whether or not you were at the kennels at 8:45. How did you know what the time of death was if you weren't there? Alec knew that the time of death being around 9 o'clock was super important as he's talking to the officers at 10:30, 11 o'clock, right after he calls 911. And I think that was sort of a missed opportunity for Creighton Waters to sort of point out the fact to Alec that unless he knew the time of death, it wouldn't matter whether or not he was down at the kennels at 8:45. And the only way he could have known the cause of death is to cause the death himself. So maybe he'll bring that up in closing. There's also been a lot of noise. I think there was another missed opportunity by Creighton Waters here. I always try to think, what would I do if I was the prosecutor? What would I do if I was the defense lawyer? And I want to say with the caveat that these cases are so stressful to be in front of the jury and be in front of the court and trying these, and you're always going to miss stuff. It's super easy for me to sit here 2,000 miles away or 3,000 miles away, or however far I am away from the trial, watching it on TV, playing armchair quarterback, saying, oh, you did this wrong, oh, you did that wrong. But one thing that I think Creighton Waters missed here, and I don't know if he's going to bring this up in closing, but the defense has made a huge, huge deal about the angle and trajectory of the bullets. They have tried to show that the shooter was someone who is in the 5'2" to 5'4" range by what angle the bullet entered the bodies at, right? And so what they would do anytime there is firearm involved homicide like this is to try to figure out where the people were when they were shot, what the trajectory of the bullets were when they entered the bodies, and where the perpetrator of the crimes was when the bullets were shot. And all of these things are interrelated. And if you know one, you might be able to tell, some facts about the other. And so what they have done in this case is to try to say, well, first of all, Alec Murdaugh is 6'5". When you see him in court, he's taller than anyone else. Tall, handsome, very, sort of muscular, manly looking guy, very imposing presence in court. And the defense has spent days and days with experts talking about how the shooter had to be 5'2" to 5'4". And we know this because of the angle that the bullets entered the body. Murdaugh testified that he drove the golf cart over to the dog kennels in his new version of events right before the homicide, and then drove it back to the house, then gets in his car, and then goes to his mom's house at Alameda when the homicides allegedly occurred. What I am guessing is if Murdaugh is sitting in that golf cart, I bet his head's about 5'2". It's so easy, and I think Creighton Waters really should have highlighted the fact that all Alec Murdaugh would have had to do was to change the angle of his body or how he was holding the weapon, and he could have made himself firing from a similar angle as someone who was standing 5'2" tall, standing straight up at 5'2". So I think there were some missed opportunities there for the prosecutor. And of course, they can't call him back to the stand. He's come and gone.
Right. And no, but that's a really good point. And it's also highlighting, Alec Murdaugh is not your average defendant. This is somebody who has tried cases himself on the prosecution side. So he might have more knowledge about how to get away with murder than perhaps most people. If he is guilty, of course, hasn't been convicted yet, but certainly a lot of smoke in this one, it seems like.
I think the timeline and the digital footprint of Alec is extremely unforgiving in this case. And I think that if he gets convicted, it's going to be because of that. The digital footprint includes him, speeding off to his mom's house, going 78 miles an hour on a country road, speeding back, walking very quickly throughout the house, taking a bunch of steps right before he leaves to go to his mom's house, not taking his phone with him down to the kennels, the Paul Murdaugh Snapchat. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence that I think circumstantially shows that he did this.
There's a lot of public discourse on this case, people following on social media, people following within the true crime space. Are there any mistakes, myths, or misconceptions that you've been seeing spread around about this case and the ongoing trial so far that you think people should, perhaps comes from like a lack of legal knowledge or anything like that?
This case has been so well covered by so many different people. I think it's really well covered. I think it's sort of unique in that. And there's been a lot of different takes on that. So that's a hard question to answer.
I don't think think this is a misconception, maybe that's the wrong word for it, but I think a lot of people that we've heard from who are interested in this case seem pretty well convinced of Alec Murdaugh's guilt. And I think some of the issues that you've raised are very interesting and kind of indicate that this could still possibly go either way, or even resulting into sort of a very unsatisfying finish, like a hung jury. And maybe if you could kind of get into what happens when there is like a lack of a conclusion in a high profile case. I mean, would you expect the prosecutor to bring charges again if there was a hung jury, or is this a situation where they may just be like, well, we got him for years on the financial crime, so I guess we're just going to go with that?
Well, I think they would certainly try him again if there were a hung jury. They wouldn't have to bring charges again. They would just have to try him again. The charges would not be dismissed following a hung jury. It would just be a mistrial. And following a mistrial, what could happen is as soon as the parties are ready, the case could go back to trial. And that's really ultimately in the unilateral discretion of the district attorney's office, of the solicitor in this case, whether or not to retry a case after a hung jury. I think they would in this case because, as you said, it's a very high-profile case. You know, most people think Alec Murdaugh is guilty. I think Alec Murdaugh is guilty. I don't know where you guys weigh in on that, but those are kind of my thoughts. If I were the prosecutor, I would certainly retry this case. It could come down to, you know, what the spread is on the hung jury. If it were 11-1 hung in favor of the defendant, you know, 11 people wanted to acquit, one person wanted to convict, which would still be a hung jury, I think that would be a less likely scenario for a retrial than if 11 people voted to convict and one person voted to acquit. And so what I always do when I have a hung jury, and they're pretty rare, I don't know, maybe had a half dozen in my career, if that, maybe 4 or 5. I have no way of knowing without going back and looking. But what I always do is ask the judge to poll the jury. And what that means is, you know, ask each individual juror what their verdict was. So I know, you know, was this a 2-10, 3-9 split in favor of the defense, or was it a 2-10, 3-9 split in favor of the prosecution? And the reason I want to know that information is, you know, what is my likelihood of being able to win the case going back forward? What is my likelihood of wanting to resolve this case if it's going to be retried? Do I want to look at trying to get some lesser charges in a plea bargain? I would be more inclined to do that if the hung jury was in favor of the prosecution.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, no, I think Kevin and I are both leaning towards guilt at this point. Obviously, he hasn't been convicted yet, but I mean, it seems like they have a very strong circumstantial case against the man. And there's a lot of, you know, that's pretty hard to overcome just from our perspectives. And yeah, I think we're in the same boat as you, where it's like, I don't know if we're convinced that he's going to be convicted, but I think we're both pretty much, you know, that looks pretty bad. and I just like one thing, just as a defense attorney, how surreal is it to see a person who was like a prosecutor being charged with like this really high profile, you know, horrible homicide? I mean, that just must, I mean, I imagine that is relatively rare.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, at any time prosecutors get charged with crimes, there's a reaction from the defense bar. Oftentimes, the people aren't surprised that a particular prosecutor got in trouble. You know, you could maybe guess which prosecutor is going to engage in that kind of conduct. I'm not talking about homicides. I'm just talking about in trouble. And so in my career, what I've seen a lot is, you know, prosecutors get DUIs, prosecutors get domestic violence charges, prosecutors get drug charges. I can't think of a prosecutor charged with a homicide anywhere near my jurisdiction. We've also seen lots of former prosecutors who have become defense lawyers get in trouble with the law. And so it's rare, but it does happen. There's a perception in the defense bars that prosecutors think that they're above the law. Whether or not that's true, you know, is subject to interpretation and opinion. And there is a perception amongst defense lawyers that when prosecutors become defense lawyers, which is frequent after they leave or retire from the prosecutor's office for whatever reason, that the former prosecutor working as the defense lawyer still thinks that they're above the bar, above the law. You do see this happen. I think that the courts want accountability. I think that prosecutors, defense lawyers, police officers, judges, anybody who is an officer of the court, anybody who works within the criminal justice system is going to be held to a higher standard by the court system than someone who is not so affiliated. The reason being they're put in a position of power, they're put in a position of trust, and when they breach that power or trust, I think the perception is that there should be more consequences to pay. Anytime a lawyer or a prosecutor gets in trouble, it's a serious matter, and the courts are going to handle it seriously, and not necessarily going to get swept under the rug.
I wanted to ask, is there anything we didn't ask you about that you think it's important for the listeners to understand or anything like that?
I think in this case, I don't believe that there are any other viable suspects that the defense has brought forth. To me, I think the timeline in this case is so harmful to the defense that it really, in my mind, draws into question that anyone other than Alex Murdaugh could have committed this. I'm fascinated to see what the jury does with this. It's hard to assess where they are without being able to look at them and see their reactions. Even if I could see that, it still could be hard to assess where they are in any given case. But for those of you who aren't watching the trial, in these cases, the court TV or whatever, MSNBC, whatever channel is showing it, never shows the jury, never names the jury on TV for privacy protection. So it's hard to assess how this case is going in the eyes of the jury without seeing them. I did hear from someone who was in the courtroom that at one point when Alex Murdaugh was crying, that a couple of the members of the jury, a couple of the female members of the jury were crying at the same time, which I think is a very bad sign for the prosecutor. I'm super anxious and excited to see what the outcome of this case is. I think it's the trial of the century in South Carolina, and I think it's one of the trials of the century in the United States.
Thanks so much to our source for his legal insights.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.